friends. Welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen.
Gosh, it feels so long since we've done one of these like proper interview episodes. So
I know.
I'm not even used to doing the intro anymore. I'm feeling super rusty. I was like, did I get it?
Well, it's funny because we're kind of totally switching things up. We normally tried to do like a midweek episode on the markets and then do like a interview episode on the Saturday. Now we're going to do an interview episode followed by another interview episode coming up on Saturday.
But this is an interview episode that was supposed to be just a casual conversation about the markets, but we got into so much more beyond it. So I'm really excited. We're going to be joined today by Congressman Seth Magaziner, who is a lifelong friend of both of ours. I went to high school with him. You went to college with him, and we'll cover our background at the beginning of the interview. But the genesis of the conversation was originally we were going to talk about how tariff announcements was leaking into the bond markets. Here we are now. It's May 15th, and we're in a totally different world. So we had some really topical things to talk about. We're going to get into the big tax bill that's being proposed, as well as some proposed bans on insider trading for elected officials, which, yes, they are proposed bans because it's currently legal. So it's pretty wild. So we strive very purposefully here not to get political, but I think we can both comfortably say that activities that are illegal for regular citizens, we are fully in support of making them illegal for elected officials as well. So I don't think that that's a terribly revolutionary concept. So this is just an absolutely fabulous conversation with Seth here. Anything else, Kristen, before we get into it?
I don't think so. This was so cool to catch up with Seth. I mean, it's so sad when we now like think back to how many years it's been since, I mean, my gosh, you were in high school and even like we were in college. We're coming up on almost 20 years since we graduated college.
Yeah,
anyway.
I'm going back for my Princeton reunion next week. So those of you who are either at Princeton right now or coming back for reunions, I'd love to see you. I'll be bopping around. I'm going to be there on Friday night and Saturday during the day, and I'm going to leave after the P-Raid because I get tired and I'm old. We didn't go last year because you and I were in New York for something, but yeah, exactly. But I went the year prior. I got so sick by day 2. I had no voice. I couldn't speak. I was held together by Dayquil. It was just a disaster. So I've learned my lesson, and I'm going to be coming home before Saturday night. But my personal favorite thing to do is to go to the Arch Sings, where they have the a cappella groups sing under the, they have the acoustic dynamics where you can stand everywhere and hear them. I love them.
We were watching Your Friends and Neighbors, and there was an episode where, again, actually the daughter wants to go to Princeton, and both of her parents went to Princeton, so they went, and there was these kids singing a cappella, and my husband turns to me, he's like, do people do a cappella outside of college? Like, I don't think it literally.
Well, we had it in high school.
But then
we had it at Milton.
Well, yes. But then like after, I mean, like, it's not like there's like a cappella groups in New York City that you see like roaming around. So I'm like, what happens to all the people that did a cappella? But can you try not to die when you fly into Newark for me?
I'm not flying into Newark. I switched my flight to Philadelphia.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
We were talking about that, and
yes, definitely not. We know all of us who are going back together, we've all changed our flights to Philadelphia.
Good.
Which is equidistant from campus. It's only an hour drive, but there's an inferior public transit situation. So we're going to Uber it and we'll figure it out. And we've got 4 ladies staying in one hotel room. It's good. It's just like college all over again.
You're leaving your husband at home?
Of course. Yes. No, I'm leaving my husband at home. Well, he came last time and he was a really good sport about it.
He has COVID again, by the way, which is like so funny. This poor guy like gets COVID every time you go to a reunion.
I know. But when we went back for my 10th reunion, this is my 10-year reunion. It's a milestone reunion. It's like, okay, as many people that you possibly know are going to be back, like maximizing your chances. We walked onto campus, and the first thing that happened was somebody recognized my husband before they recognized me. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. And it was like someone we both worked with at Barclays, but she like recognized him. And I was like, man, you gotta show me up everywhere we go. But yes, if anyone is going to be on Princeton's campus on Friday, what is that? Friday, May 23rd and Saturday, May 24th. Come find me. I'm 06, so I would love to meet you. Let's get back to our episode with Seth. This was honestly such an eye-opening episode for me because you want to educate yourself about politics, but like this day and age, where can you even go to find neutral information of just like how things work that isn't like really polarized or whatever? And I think Seth did such a great job of breaking down just facts, and he was very quick and honest about disclosing when he's like, here's my bias, right? Here's how I'm framing this. rather than, just immediately saying everything's terrible that he doesn't like and everything's great that he agrees with. I think he did a great job of presenting these just basic facts. And I really admire him for that. And I think that Seth really brought like a gravitas and a dignity to our conversation that I think is something that is oftentimes missing in political discourse these days. And I just really appreciate that. Regardless of what you think about his politics, I think this is a great episode to listen to.
Let's bring Seth on.
Awesome. Seth, just so our listeners know, this is truly, we always say like hi friends at the beginning of our episodes. This is just a chat amongst friends. Seth and I go back to the year 1998 in the last century. Seth was one of my classmates in high school. And Seth was a celebrity in high school. And I always knew you were going places because we had to do these things. Ironic how this all comes full circle. We had to do these things called class 4 talks. So in high school, we were organized not freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, but by class numbers. And class 4 was freshmen, class 1 seniors. And so part of it's like an academic hazing ritual that they had at my high school called class 4 talks. And you had to prepare a speech and you had to give it in front of 50% of your class. And this was to get us comfortable with like speaking in front of our peers. It's actually something I've noticed that my kids' school does starting in kindergarten. They get them up and speaking really often. I was terrified of public speaking, and Kristen had to drag me kicking and screaming even to do a podcast, which we didn't have video for the first like 10 episodes of. But Seth made a name for himself early on in our high school years by having hands down the best class 4 talk. Had people rolling in the aisles. They like made him do an encore because it was so amazing. And you, Seth, have always been just a tremendous speaker. You've always been so eloquent. You've always been so creative. And then you went on and went to Brown, and you were classmates with Kristen there. So we've all known each other.
Not only classmates, he was in my freshman year dorm, and he's married to one of my very close friends from Brown. So it's like the coolest thing. Again, I got introduced to you through Jen. When Jen, you came to visit me freshman year.
Halloween.
Well,
I probably wore the same outfit. I didn't have anything, so I was like, black turtleneck, I'll just be like a cat.
No, it's a total small world story, right? Because like you two were best friends growing up, and then I went to high school with Jen, college with Kristen independently, and now you two are also crushing it. And
you're so kind.
Some of my like biggest memories of Jen from high school are like we were in a couple of math classes together, where like no surprise, you were always like the standout math student. And,
I don't remember this at all, so this is great.
You don't remember like Mr. Bisbee's honors math class?
I loved Mr. Bisbee.
Yeah. I had to spend a lot of time getting extra help, which you did not. And it shows. Even now.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's very kind. But so Seth is now a congressman. You were the treasurer of the state of Rhode Island. And we, as life has gone on, increasingly know more people who went into kind of the private sector and have now served in various roles in government. But Seth, you were kind of like the first person I knew who was like, I'm getting into government, like very early on. You did Teach for America right out of school, right? And I know that does galvanize a lot of people towards ultimately like working in politics because of what they see that's broken about the educational system in America. But you then went on and got your MBA, correct?
Yeah. So I taught elementary school in Louisiana, like South Louisiana. And I always kind of had it in the back of my head that maybe I wanted to do more in like policy or politics one day. But when I was in Louisiana, I was in this small town, and like the one nice restaurant in the town closed down, and then like a couple of the other businesses closed down. And like we didn't know it at the time, but it was the beginning of the Great Recession.
Yeah.
And I kind of started thinking there's all of these like big financial decisions being made that are impacting my school, impacting my students. And like, we don't know what's going on. And so I went to business school, like no idea what I was going to do really, but just wanted to learn about the markets and like learn finance. I got a job after that working in asset management, specifically ESG investing, which like
early mover, by the way. Like ESG was a little known acronym in whatever that was, 2008,
before
2009.
anyone knew what it was. So I'm pretty sure I was the lowest paid person out of my business school class. And like I went to SOMBL, and like I think they were pretty upset at me because I made like $60,000 or something my first year out of business school.
They were like, how are you possibly going to donate?
Yeah, right. But it was great. I learned a lot. I was like an equity analyst. I covered financial services and energy and banks especially, and did that for a while, learned a lot. And I had done my business school internship at a VC firm in Rhode Island run by this woman named Gina Raimondo, who like I stayed in touch with. And I actually had gone back to her like, can I have a job working for your VC firm? And she said, no, I'm going to run for state treasurer of Rhode Island. And we stayed in touch. And then she later went on to become governor and then U.S. Commerce Secretary. But basically, when the state treasurer position opened up, I was 30 years old, and I was like, this could be a way to do public service, but with sort of my finance-ish background, not nearly as deep a background as the two of you have, but by then I had.
I love how we both like give a face.
I had like 4 years of private sector experience, and I didn't know what I didn't know. Like I ran, I gave it a shot, it worked out, and I was the youngest person elected state treasurer in the entire 400-year history of Rhode Island.
That's amazing. And you must have been one of the youngest state treasurers in most states, right?
Yeah.
Like I would imagine it's not really like something that most kids are doing when they're 25 years old.
But it was a great job. And like a big part of it, state treasurer, like the position is different in every state. There's some states where it's like a tiny office with 6 people. And then others like Massachusetts, for example, it's like an enormous office and they regulate marijuana and gambling and all kinds. In Rhode Island, it's mostly an asset management job. Like I managed the state pension fund. I managed the state 529 plan. I had like a team of CFAs and people working for me, and it was great. And then,
for our listeners who don't know what a 529 plan is, actually, why don't you explain it, Seth? I'm just like, it's this thing that I really deeply believe in. But can you explain to our listeners what a 529 plan is?
Yeah, it's a tax advantage college savings plan. So depending on what state you live in, you put money into a 529 account. You might get a little break on your state income taxes for your contributions. You save that money, and then when it comes time to spend it on tuition or other education-associated expenses for your kids, you don't pay capital gains tax on the investment earnings. So it's like a tax-efficient way to save for college. So it's like very much like an IRA or like another like participant-directed investment plan. But the odd thing is that for whatever reason, when these were created back in the 90s, Congress decided that they had to be run by states. And so it's like this weird...
I think mine's in like Utah or Colorado or something. Like
exactly.
I'm invested in a random one.
So they can only be run by states, but the states can market them nationally.
Yeah.
And so it's this weird market where the 50 states compete against each other to sell an investment product.
Yes.
It would be like if Congress had said that like IRAs could only be sold by by like cities. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense if you take a step back, but that's just the way it is. And speaking of early movers, Rhode Island back in the 90s was one of the first states to launch.
Nice.
And so even though Rhode Island is the smallest state, we actually had one of the largest 529 plans by assets in the country. And like we had like more Californians with Rhode Island 529 plans than Rhode Islanders. So like, we managed across our whole office, all of our programs. By the time I left, we were probably close to $20 billion. And it was a great job. I loved it.
I'm just so curious because we talk all the time about private equity firms, hedge funds who go to different capital allocators and they try to get investments. Are you one of those people that would potentially be meeting with like a hedge fund, a private equity firm and making decisions about allocating to them? Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, totally.
So that's why you said
it was fascinating work. So I'd say like a lot of our work was on like broad asset allocation, like what percent do we want in equities, private equities, fixed income, et cetera. And then sort of like making those high level decisions. And then, like manager selection was probably 80% of what our investment team did. And like part of the ritual, especially in pre-COVID times, is that like all of these principals, like these managers of like really big private equity funds sometimes, like actual billionaires would have to like come to our little office in Rhode Island.
And like kiss your ring.
Yeah, right. For, like we had a couple of times, I was treasurer for 8 years and like we were always nervous that it would be hard to recruit strong staff to work for us because like public sector salaries obviously are much lower than the private sector equivalent. Mm-hmm. But whenever we had an opening, we were like so pleasantly surprised by how easy it was to recruit good talent because like you don't have to fundraise. Mm-hmm. The hours are good and the work.
Can I ask you what junior pay is like? Because I have no idea what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, I think like junior, probably 100, 150.
But so it's totally comparable to coming into an investment bank, only with like, that's awesome. I didn't know that at all.
But like, I don't know, our CIO was probably like 300-ish. Though.
Okay, so it's more capped as you get,
Yeah.
like it's capped on the upside as you get senior, but that's great pay at a junior level.
I was
150K.
gonna say, even at like an endowment, I mean, most endowment CIO pay is publicly available. Like you can oftentimes look it up.
Oh, I'm just too
And I
lazy to
think-
look this up, Kristen.
Oh, well,
That's
again,
what I'm
I mean,
asking.
I think if you're at an endowment with like $2 billion, like I said, I'm sort of making these numbers up, but like I have looked them up on the semi-recent side, you're probably making like whatever, $800,000. Again, the Yales are going to be very different, but like, I don't know, that's still pretty good.
Yeah, and I said I think a standard profile for like a CIO of a medium-sized state pension fund like ours is like someone who maybe worked on Wall Street, made a bunch of money, or like worked elsewhere in the private sector, made a bunch of money, and is like ready for like a slower,
They want an iceberg to float off onto that's less stressful and still pays well.
Yeah.
And for the record, I mean, like if you're living in Providence, Rhode Island, your cost of living is a lot lower than if you're living in New York City. So like, they're probably the same when you factor in cost of living. So I'm just saying.
100%.
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't make that kind of money as the elected, but it was a great job. It's a weird thing, by the way, to like be the boss and have most of your employees make more money than you. I guess it's not, I guess there are other places where that happens, but it's a funny thing in government. And I worked closely with then Governor Raimondo. She asked me to lead a state school construction camp program. So we developed a program to like rebuild public schools across the state. It was awesome. And now I'm in Congress where everything is just
so talk to us about your role in Congress. I know we're like, let's talk about random 529 plans. And here we are. We want to talk about big national tax bills and insider trading bans.
Yeah. So I was elected to Congress 2 years ago, and this week that we're recording, like big things are going on here. So the House Republicans are trying to move a very big tax bill that will have major implications in like many facets of American life. And I'm not going to be partisan here, but I'm a Democrat. I'm not going to vote for this tax bill. I don't like it. But I can give you a neutral analysis of what's in it.
If you were breaking it down I have a 7 and a 9-year-old. If you were breaking it down for them and just being like, this is how everything works, that's pretty much my level of understanding of most things in politics. I'd love kind of the 10,000 foot view of what's in this tax bill. What's surprising relative to what everyone had expected coming out of the first, call it 100 days of the presidency, and what are kind of the biggest issues that we should be focused on from what's going to move markets?
Yeah, so at a very high level, you've got about $5 trillion of new tax cuts, about $2 trillion of spending cuts. This is over the next 10 years. And about depending on how you do the math, $3 to $5 trillion of new debt over the next 10 years. Yeah. So like, it's actually mind blowing, but like we're cutting $2 trillion from major programs, from healthcare, from SNAP, which is food stamps, like $2 trillion of cuts, but still increasing the debt by $3 trillion because of like how big these tax cuts are. So like walking through each of it. So the spending cuts, and this is the stuff that on my side of the aisle we don't like, but huge cuts to Medicaid. Medicaid is the healthcare program that helps primarily low-income people. It's their source of health insurance. And Medicaid is paid for mostly by the federal government, but there's a state match. And so the specific changes are like complicated, but at a high level, under this bill, the federal match to the states would go down quite a bit, and states would have to decide either the states are going to kick in more money by raising taxes at the state level or cutting other programs at the state level, or are just going to have to like disenroll a lot of people from the program. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the neutral, nonpartisan like estimator of all these things, thinks that it's going to lead to about 8 to 10 million people losing their health insurance, which is a lot. Like that's like a significant chunk of the cohort that has gained insurance since the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Also, similar situation with SNAP, food stamps, which have historically been paid entirely by the federal government, but administered by the states, like state offices administer them. Now this bill would require that the states cover 25% of the cost.
Okay.
And there's all sorts of new eligibility requirements, and there's other cuts too, but like those are the two big ones, Medicaid and SNAP.
Okay.
Now on the tax cut side, the biggest part is taking the 2016 tax cuts that were set to expire and making them permanent. So there were a whole lot of things that were changed in 2016, but the biggest ones are they lowered some of the individual income tax rates. So like the top rate, they lowered from 39.6 to 37, things like that would become permanent. They increased the standard deduction, which would become permanent. And actually, I think they want to increase it some more. The corporate tax rate was lowered significantly. Like that's a big one. So,
well, that's the one that I feel like I know, especially people who are kind of our audience. It used to be that the U.S. corporate tax rate was 35%, which was the highest in the world, got dropped down to 21%, which is, it's competitive with the rest of the world, but it's definitely, I would argue, generous. I had heard Trump talking about wanting to lower it further to 15%, but I don't think that did not make it into this bill.
That didn't make it in because this was like one of the biggest cost drivers of the bill, right? It's a big change. And the old structure before 2016 was progressive structure. 35% was the top bracket. Now, now it's a 21% like flat on everyone corporate tax.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize it was progressive. Oh, that's so interesting.
I mean, again, like big companies.
For the companies that you're typically dealing with at an investment bank.
Yeah.
Totally.
But like,
but the Wall Street level,
I'm like, what would our tax rate go to?
Yeah. So like the biggest thing is in terms of cost is like making all of those things permanent. And then there's a debate still going on about what to do about this, what's called the SALT cap.
Yes.
Another thing that I think your audience probably is very familiar with.
Yes.
So,
well, that's not necessarily true. We have our audience is bifurcated. So we have the young people aspiring to start their jobs who probably don't know what SALT is. And then we have all the people who have their homes in New York City and in Westchester and in Greenwich who are like, SALT,
So from the very beginning of the federal income tax, like early 20th century, from the very beginning, there was this issue of certain states that already had their own income taxes being like, hey, double taxation, we're going to get taxed twice. And so from the very beginning, you had the ability to write off your state and local taxes towards your federal tax liability, right? And so if you're from a state that has like a pretty high income tax or property tax rate, like a New York or a Massachusetts, then you got to write a lot of that off. In 2016, they almost entirely got rid of that in order to pay for the other tax cuts. Putting like my partisan hat on for just a second, we'll say, well, the 2016 tax cuts were tax cuts that mostly benefited the rich. That's true, but also like benefited the rich, especially in like the low tax states like Florida.
Right.
If you were a high income person in some of these high tax states like New York or Massachusetts, you probably came out worse or may have come out worse. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, just to give our listeners an order of magnitude, we have friends whose property tax bills are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range who live in New York State. I mean, that is a huge thing to now. I don't care how wealthy you are. All of a sudden, when you were writing off $150,000 and now that's all coming straight off the top. That's serious.
So I think if you're a wealthy person who lives in New York, Massachusetts, et cetera, you're like, this was a money grab from people in Florida, like from people in Massachusetts and Connecticut.
Yeah, that's how it feels.
One quick question just to clarify, though, with the proposed change in SALT that we can talk about here in terms of the specifics, is that for earners below a certain threshold, or is that going to be applied to everyone? Because my understanding is it was earners below a certain threshold who would get a break from SALT.
I'd have to look at the details, but basically as it exists now, post 2016, you can still deduct the first $10,000. So they basically capped the SALT deduction at $10,000 of state and local taxes, which
that's for any income earner.
Anybody. Yeah. And so if you're someone like me in public service who doesn't make millions of dollars a year, the standard deduction is a more attractive option than just itemizing SALT plus your charitable giving and whatever else. Lots of people could claim the SALT deduction, but a lot of people just don't because it's not worth it. So what's still at issue now, and they're still debating this, I think literally as we speak, is a lot of members from the blue states or the high tax states, particularly the Republican members who are actually in the room where these negotiations are happening, are advocating for either eliminating or raising the cap. And it's unclear where it will land because eliminating the cap or even raising it to like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, it's hugely expensive. Because again, remember, putting in this SALT cap is like a big part of how they paid for the original
Right.
tax plan in 2016.
Right.
And so that's still a very hot issue, and we'll see how that unfolds in the next couple weeks.
Got it. That was super helpful. And then what about estate taxes?
Yeah, so 2016 raised the estate tax exemption from, I think it had been 5 million to, what was it?
I think
15
it's
or 20?
13 and change, maybe
Yeah.
like $13.99.
Yeah, and so now they want to bump it up again to.
Well, isn't it set to expire and go back down to 7 or no?
All of this is set to expire. if
Yeah,
they
so I think
don't
it's supposed to
extend
go
it.
back down to
Yeah.
7, but
Yeah.
the proposal is to bump it up to 15 per person and 30 per married household, I think.
Exactly. So that's why, like, again, like when we say disproportionately, the tax cuts help people on the higher end, it's stuff like that. But like all that being said, I think what would maybe be interesting to you both as like bond people and to your audience is like the debt implications.
Yes.
Right? Because that's the part of all of this that people aren't talking about enough, in my opinion.
Yes.
We can argue about whether the cuts are warranted, about whether the tax cuts are good or bad, but the debt part, I think we should be much more concerned with than like the media seems to be concerned with right now.
Yes.
So the scoring says that this will increase the debt by $3 trillion and change.
Meaning, so our current outstanding debt is something on the order of magnitude of 36 trillion and change. We're now going up to 39 trillion. Correct?
At least. But like there are some assumptions underlying that I think are very optimistic. So for example, one of the oldest tricks in the book in Washington in budgeting is like a lot of the tax cuts would kick in immediately, but a lot of the pay-fors are like in the out years.
What do you mean a pay forward?
So a pay-for. So like the estate tax, for example, or the lower corporate tax rate, like that just goes into effect in year one or continues in year one, right? Whereas like the cuts to Medicaid don't start for a few years from now.
Yeah.
And so like, will they ever actually happen?
Got it.
Or will Congress, when the time comes, Congress will be like, oh, we don't want to kick 10 million people off their health insurance, so never mind, right? And
It's
so
like an asset liability mismatch, if you will, to put it back in pension fund terms.
it's a gimmick, right?
I was going to say, I mean, again, getting a little bit nerdy into some of the corporate finance aspects of things. I remember, again, in like 2017, one of the things that at the time there was like in 2017, you could deduct like 100% of the CapEx you spent in that first year. And then in the next year, it was only down to 80%. And then the next year, it was down to 60%. And I was kind of like, so it juices the economy while whoever is in office is in office. And then you start to see the ramifications of it 4 years down the road when they're no longer in office, you know?
Like if we're going to take the benefit immediately, but we're going to put off the pain. The other thing, like importantly, is all of these projections about, okay, $2 trillion in spending cuts, $5 trillion in change in tax cuts, $3 trillion. There are assumptions that go into all those projections, right? And the assumption that they are using is 2.6% GDP growth per year, which the Fed is only projecting like 1.7 or 1.8. So in these out years. And so we'll see who's right. But if you think that 2.5 is aggressive for out year GDP growth, then like the debt implications will actually be much worse than what they're projecting. It'll be much more than 3 trillion of new debt because less GDP growth means less tax revenue comes in, means bigger deficits, means more debt, right? So like, again, like the actual debt implications I think could be very significant.
So one question I had, and this is again goes back to just like my misunderstanding of most things government. I feel like I never took any kind of civics in. I mean, again, Jen, Weston Public Schools. Like I don't think I ever learned a single thing about government. But I always thought that in order to pass this type of tax bill, normally, and again, this is please correct me if I'm wrong. Normally, if you were increasing the debt, you would need, call it like 2/3 of a majority.
Yes.
Again, I don't know if that's right. So the loophole is you basically say that it's not going to raise the debt at all. So you're supposed to have again the sort of cuts to offset the increase. So I'm curious how they're able to even add to the deficit to begin with.
That is such a good question. That is such a good question because there's all kinds of like tomfoolery going on around this right now. So yes, in the House, our rules, like the majority party can kind of do whatever they want, but the Senate has very specific rules about the impact of the debt when we pass bills like this. And the rule specifically is that a budget that adds to the debt requires 60 votes to pass.
Okay.
A budget that is debt neutral over a 10-year window only requires 50 votes. So this whole thing is predicated on this package is supposed to be debt neutral.
Right.
However, what the Republican leadership in the Senate is arguing is, well, these tax cuts that were about to expire, let's use that as the baseline. And if we just assume that they were always going to be permanent, then we're not, on paper, we're not actually adding to the debt.
Okay, understood.
Which like, the law says that they were supposed to expire. Like, now it's unclear.
We're just arguing from two different premises. Understood.
Right, yeah. But it's unclear whether the Senate parliamentarian will agree to that or not. So the Senate parliamentarian is like this nonpartisan person that enforces the rules of the Senate. This has never been tried before, this concept of like, oh, these tax cuts that were supposed to be expiring, we're just going to assume that they were permanent and use that as our baseline. And so it's never been tried before. We don't know how the parliamentarian is going to rule. If the parliamentarian rules against, then this whole thing could just get blown up and we'll have to figure out.
And it's back to square one.
It's back to square one. But then there's also a question, just to play out even further, who hires the parliamentarian? Like, I don't think there's ever been a case where the majority party didn't like a parliamentarian's ruling and fired them over it. But like, in theory, that could happen. So
yeah, who's eligible to be parliamentarian? Like, is there a parliamentarian now? Have we found this person? These are dumb questions, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's a real person. Like, she has this job, has had this job across multiple Congresses with like both Democrats and Republicans in charge. So again, it's supposed to be like a neutral, nonpartisan position. But I think in theory, if the Republican majority didn't like the answer on this very big question about current policy baseline, in theory, could they sack that person and replace and hire a new parliamentarian? Maybe. I mean, hopefully not. That would be a huge...
How are they neutral if the majority party has the ability to terminate their job?
I mean...
Okay, I like that.
Right. I mean, by
okay. That's more of a rhetorical question than understood. I meant that as a legitimate question.
Kind of back to like a lot of norms that have existed in Washington for a while now are being broken, and so could this be another one? Like, we just don't know.
Okay, but so in the event that this does get passed, and regardless of if we are adding to the debt, what about the debt ceiling?
Yeah, so the debt ceiling increase would have to be included in the bill so that we don't default this summer.
Could you quickly remind people what the debt ceiling is?
The federal government cannot borrow an unlimited amount without authorization of Congress. Like, Congress sets a limit on how much the government can borrow. And we are set to hit that limit, the Treasury Secretary estimates, in July. So Congress has to either vote to raise that debt ceiling, like that debt limit, that borrowing limit, or else the U.S. would default on its debt for the first time in history, which could potentially be catastrophic for the markets. And
just to give everyone some perspective on this, though, we have raised the debt ceiling every single time it has been in question, despite hemming and hawing and government shutdowns. It has never not been raised when the issue has come up.
The debt ceiling is, to me, just like such like a stupid rule, because it's like you've already agreed and spent this money, so now we're just agreeing to pay it. It's like your credit card bill coming, and you're like, should we, actually pay this bill? Like, maybe.
Well, and also, like, you all know this much better than I do, but the entire bedrock of our financial system is that U.S. Treasuries are supposed to be riskless, or at least T-bills are, and the U.S. pays its bills is an underlying premise of like the entire financial system. So like, if that's no longer the case, what happens? And nobody's wanted to look at that. But real quick, on the debt in general, I think like particularly for those of us who are like of the millennial era, people don't understand like how big a deal this is. Like, because we grew up in a time when the national debt was actually not that much of a problem, and it's become more of a problem in recent years. There have always been people who are like, oh, we borrow trillions of dollars and it's too much. But like, if you actually look at debt to GDP, like how much the country borrows relative to the size of our whole economy, when we were like in the 90s and early 2000s and we were all in school, our debt to GDP was like 60%, maybe 70%, which compared to other large countries and even compared to our own history was like not very high. And interest rates were also low. And so the percentage of the federal budget going into debt service was also not very high. But we've now gone from 50, 60, where we were in the 90s and early 2000s, to 120% roughly debt to GDP, which is where we are today. The only other time in our history we've been that high was at the end of World War II. And if this bill goes through as is, the scoring says we'll get to about 130%, which would be the highest in our history. And that's using all of these rosy assumptions that I just laid out. Like in real life, 140, 150, like then we're really in a place where like it's just unprecedented. And what does that mean for, the U.S.'s ability to finance ourselves? What does that mean for the cost of capital across the entire market? Debt service as a percentage of the federal budget, because rates have also gone up in addition to debt going up. We'll be spending $2 trillion of the federal budget every year on debt service. 5, 10, 20% of the federal budget would just be going into service. I think we've been cultured in our generation to be like, the national debt is like not actually a thing, but like it is now. Like the world has changed.
Can you just remind me, and Jen, maybe you know the answer to this too, what is Japan's and what is the debt spiral that we talk about?
A debt trap, where you have to borrow money just to pay the interest on your debt.
Just to pay the interest on the debt. Got it.
I don't know Japan's debt to GDP ratio off the top of my head. I did not come armed with numbers.
All right, I'm looking it up.
I think like right now, like the U.S., our debt to GDP, we're like relatively middle of the pack. But again, like middle of the pack, that pack includes some countries that are very financially challenged, right? And again, numbers are numbers, and like the debt to GDP is much higher now than it was 10, 15 years ago. And also debt service is much higher because of rates.
Right.
And so at a certain point, like we all have to agree that it does matter.
Japan's debt to GDP is 255%, but their interest rate, because rates are obviously so low, is basically like half of ours. So I feel like from a debt service perspective, they're probably comparable to us. But anyway.
Well, yeah. So using Japan as the framework to talk about this, I think, Seth, kind of the other missing historical framework is that all these alarm bells went off in 2008. And it's kind of a boy who cried wolf scenario. So in 2008, when we went through the global financial crisis, I was sitting on the trading floor at Lehman Brothers. And when the Fed was starting to talk about quantitative easing, every single academic and pundit was like, we are going to become Japan. Japan was the lesson we were supposed to learn from, that you don't increase the money supply so much that you all of a sudden just completely trash your currency and you have this massive debt burden that you have to deal with, right? That's what happened to Japan. Why are we going to do that to ourselves when, to your point, Seth, we had come from a historic low of whatever it was, like 24% debt to GDP or whatever it was back in the 20th century at the lows, and now suddenly have this explode. Yeah. But those alarm bells were sounded, and then nothing happened. We all of a sudden had this like, you were a moron if you didn't buy the S&P at 666. Why didn't you buy real estate in 2010? Like, why didn't you do all these things? And when you talk about interest rates being high, Seth, I mean, they're higher than they were when they were zero, but they're not high historically speaking.
Yeah. Well, I think what we have now that we haven't had far back as I can remember is like high debt and higher rates at the same time.
Right.
But again, 5% on interest rates is not high. It's just not zero. And because we didn't term out our debt when we had the opportunity to, when rates were zero, and we funded most of quantitative easing with very short term, we're now left with like, oh no, all of our models were predicated around 2% 10-year notes forever. Why? Why were they? That makes no sense. So like, I'm not saying it's not a real problem, but I think why going from whatever it is, 120% debt to GDP to 130%, it's like, another 10%, because we've never had to pay the piper, because we cried wolf for so long from like an academic and theoretical standpoint, but we never saw all of the things that were predicted. We do recap on the HBO Max or whatever they've rebranded themselves in the last 24 hours to be show HBO Industry, Max. Right? And they've got the very first episode, the crackerjack analyst being like, okay, China's going to sell all its U.S. bonds because the U.S. is printing too much debt and they're going to lose confidence and interest rates are going to skyrocket. Therefore, whatever it was, you should buy high strike payer swaptions or something like that. And it's like, well, that never happened. The only time we came close was right after Liberation Day. And that's when I freaked out. That's when everyone freaked out. And that's what I think stayed Trump's hands on the tariffs.
100%. It was the bond market that scared Trump. Like,
and that was a 50 basis point sell-off, by the way. That wasn't a 500 basis point sell-off.
It wasn't, right. This is a whole other conversation we probably don't have time for anymore. But this was not a brilliant negotiating tactic. This was like trying something. The bond market freaked out a little bit and then pulling back. But it's like one of the things, like at some point it'll matter.
Yeah.
And to me, like my own view is we should be careful about increasing our debt to GDP too much in general. But if we are going to increase it, Like, I think it should be for things that produce more broad-based growth, but that's a debate for another day.
Well, we also haven't talked about the fact that all of these entitlements that are being cut, those are unfunded. I read some paper like a year ago that the total amount of underfunded entitlements, that's like 70 trillion. And we don't talk about that in the deficit.
Yeah, no, for me, I generally support raising revenue more on the high end and using it to help shore up some of these programs. Mm-hmm. But again, that's an ideological debate that like people can decide where they fall. But it is pretty wild to me to have trillions of dollars of cuts, but still be increasing the debt by trillions more. But here we are.
No, I fully appreciate that. And I think that that's something that we really appreciate your perspective on and thinking about what everyone's weighing in terms of whether this gets passed. Or I didn't know that there was this very binary assumption that had to be met for this thing to even be considered at all, which is fascinating to me.
And so if that doesn't happen, we'll see. I mean, we're still going to have to increase the debt ceiling regardless so that we don't default this year. But whether the tax bill goes through or not, we'll see.
Well, and one other thing, and then I know I really want to talk about insider trading, Bill. So we'll get to that in one second. But the other thing is obviously what's going on with these tariffs. There is the argument that we are going to be getting some income from them. What obviously is not then baked into some of those growth assumptions you were talking about is the impact on growth from those tariffs, which we saw what happened in, what was it, like the 1920s with Smoot-Hawley? I mean, right now things are on pause. I mean, yay, I guess we're down to 30% on China. It's still, I mean, that's higher than it used to be. So the actual impact on growth, we don't know what is actually going to result. And I mean, I am a perma bear. I'm always like waiting for the next shoe to drop. It was funny. Jen's normally bearish. We were talking last week and I was like, oh, everything's horrible. She's like, no, things are great. The bond market's doing well. So, but anyway, with that being said, insider trading and the ability of Congress people to trade on information that they have, again, inside information on, are setting policy on, is wild that it's legal. And so I know you have a bill and we'd love for you to talk a little bit about what the bill is.
We also start by defining insider trading? Because I think insider trading is one of those things that is really easy to bandy about as a term when you're like, seems unfair, but like what actually is insider trading and what is it specifically that you are trying to change?
Well, I remember from my CFA level 1 exam.
Which neither of us have taken, by the way.
I only did level 1. I stopped after level 1. But insider trading is trading off of non-public information, right?
And to be clear, to settle kind of one common issue, can it happen in every kind of security? Can it happen not just in equities, but also in fixed income?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And also another, I think, misconception is you don't have to be an officer or an employee of the company to engage in insider trading. Right. Mm-hmm. Like if you are walking down the street and you come across a piece of paper that has non-public information about what a company is going to do and you trade off of it, you committed a crime.
Yes.
This is like on the Series 7 exam.
Right. Because like in order for the market to be fair to all participants, or at least in theory fair to all participants, everybody should be working with the same set of information. Martha Stewart went to jail for insider trading for a company she didn't work for, but because somebody had told her something and she traded off of it. Right. So in Congress, what does that look like? We have all kinds of material inside information that the average member of the public doesn't. Right. Like what might be in a bill or not in a bill. I'll give you a very specific example. PBM reform is a big hot topic.
What's PBM? Sorry.
Pharmacy benefit managers.
Thank you.
Regulating how drugs are priced, basically.
Got it.
Yeah.
And there's this big reform package that would really hurt some of the big PBM companies like CVS and United Health. It would maybe help the drug manufacturers. It would maybe help consumers. But there's this package that's bipartisan that would like significantly change this industry. Back in December, it was very unexpectedly put into a budget bill that we were about to vote on, and then very unexpectedly taken out the next day. So anybody in Congress who knew in advance that this was going to be in the bill and or knew in advance that it was going to be taken back out, like these are like market moving events that are inside information that other market participants wouldn't have. So that's like one very specific example of like the potential for insider trading.
Yeah.
Lately, people have been talking about tariffs. If any of my Republican friends here heard from Trump before he makes a tariff announcement, like that is inside information and trade off of it.
Right. One specific trade that we highlighted was at the time the largest, and I think still the largest trade that ever went through, at least to my knowledge, as a block trade of TY futures. So futures contracts on 10-year treasuries. And when we posted a video about this, like one, offline in a Bloomberg article or whatever, all of a sudden everyone was like, insider trading. But every single comment on social media that we got was like, it's insider trading because of XYZ. And it was all in different directions, right?
Yeah.
But after the fact, all of the Monday morning quarterbacks were saying, well, this was everyone who knew that tariffs were coming because this trade took place about a month before. I have no idea what it was or whatever. Yeah. But the point is like it could have been something.
So there's
like
two big problems with members of Congress being able to trade stocks. One is what we just talked about, which is like we have access to inside information that the average member of the public doesn't, and that's just like fundamentally unfair, and also illegal if we trade off of it. The second problem is like when we vote for or against a bill, we should be doing it because we think it's like the best thing for the country, not the best thing for our investment portfolio.
Right. So why is this allowed?
It shouldn't be. And so I have a bill that would ban it, that would ban members of Congress from trading stocks. And it's a fascinating political issue because it's an issue with bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition. So this is not like so much of what we deal with here, as you can imagine, is very partisan in this environment and like Dems and Republicans arguing with each other over everything. But on this, like my co-lead, my first co-sponsor on the bill is Chip Roy, who's like a leader of the Freedom Caucus, the far right faction. The far right faction of the Republicans is my co-lead on the bill. I'm a Democrat. We have very different politics, but we work together very well on this. Another person that I'm working with who's very vocal on this is like Ocasio-Cortez. And so like there's like 7 or 8 of us that are like really driving this, and it's like left, right, and middle. So is the opposition. So it's like a very interesting political coalition that's come together. And
what is
and
the argument?
Fun to work on.
Yeah, what is the argument against it?
Like, well, and how would you implement it? So I'm curious because you said that there are competing bills. So what's different about the bills being proposed?
Yeah. So why would anyone be against this? Well, they shouldn't be. I mean, I'm biased obviously because it's my bill. But
no. I think we can all agree. We try not to get political on this show. This is one thing where it's like, come on, guys, common sense.
Come on. So I think, look, let me say it this way. The supporters, those of us who support banning members of Congress from trading stocks are very vocal about it. The opponents are very quiet about it.
Oh, I'm sure.
But they're like whispering into the leader's ears, like, please don't do this. And I think for some people, they have practical concerns. It's like, oh, will I still be able to save for my kids' college? Will I still be able to save for retirement? The answer is yes, because we would still allow people to invest in like broadly held mutual funds and things like that, and ETFs. But also, I mean, members of Congress, our salaries have been frozen since I think like 2003 or something like that. So like the purchasing power of our salaries is 30% lower than it was a decade or so ago. And you got to maintain houses in 2 different places on that. So like,
I've heard.
These are not good arguments. I'm not defending.
But I do think there is something to be said. I actually have heard Scott Galloway talk about this. That he's like, we should be raising the pay for Congress people, for presidents, for whoever, because we want to stop the grift. And so does it make sense that you're working and it's a hard job to get? There's a lot of responsibility. Like, yes, pay better, and also like take steps to ensure that there's not things that are going to have conflicts of interest. I mean, other countries do that.
Yeah. And then to answer Jen's question, so what's going on right now? So let me first say this issue has been kicking around for years, but it's only in the last month or so that we've gained, I think, real momentum. And it started with the trading around the tariffs and all of the media attention around that. And did members of Congress actually trade off of inside information around Liberation Day? I don't know. It's not like people go around bragging about it if they did. But it got the media interested. Yeah. And then a week after that, Hakeem Jeffries, who's our Democratic leader in the House, came out in favor of a ban, and he was the first party leader of either party in either chamber to come out in favor. A few days after that, Trump was asked the question, and he said yes, he would sign it. So that got the Republicans excited. Just yesterday, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, came out in favor. So we've got some momentum now all of a sudden. And one of the stumbling blocks that we're now working through is there are a few different competing versions of the bills. And so those of us who are leading the different bills are now huddling up and trying to hash out the differences. My bill is the one that has the most co-sponsors, like the most demonstrated support, but I'm not saying my bill is perfect, and so we're all trying to hash it out. So what are the issues that we're trying to hash out? Number one, what do you do with the stocks you already own when you get elected, right? do you just have to sell them and take a big tax hit? Or like, congratulations, you got elected to Congress, you have to pay a big tax bill? Or, how do you handle that? And so one concept that I think we're strongly considering is basically allowing a one-time deferral of capital gains if you sell and reinvest.
And doesn't that happen already for members of like the executive branch?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not like this is groundbreaking new policy that doesn't exist elsewhere in government.
So I think that's the way we're leaning. There's another concept of just like putting your assets in a qualified blind trust and having others manage them. And there's pros and cons to that approach.
And like you can't make a phone call to those others who manage them.
Exactly. So that's one issue that I think we're close, but like that we're working through. The other big one is like the penalties for noncompliance. Is it like your spouse forgot or your broker forgot and like accidentally bought a stock, and even though you told them not to, you're going to jail? Or is it like,
regular people go to jail or like lose their jobs,
I was going to say, this is what happens in the financial services industry all the time. When you're working in banking, there are so many hoops you have to jump through to like get clearance to buy or sell a stock. Yeah. And by the way, the consequences for not following it is you're out,
or you go to jail.
Yeah.
Or you go to jail.
You go to jail for insider trading, but and that should be the case for everybody, no matter what, including members of Congress. I'm talking about not insider trading, but about like
your family member, like your distant cousin goes and buys a single name stock. I get it, but like
we do want to cover immediate family members as well.
Yeah.
And so, again,
this is already in place for bank employees, even ones who aren't even the ones who aren't over the wall. If you're on the public market side of things, you can't
So this again, it's like this is what we got to work out is like what are the appropriate penalties and like what are the appropriate
Go call Morgan Stanley and be like, what do you do with your employees? Can you just draft it up into our bill?
Do that. So what I'll say is this, is that like it's going well. I think we're like very close to having a consensus bill, and that will eliminate one of the excuses for not moving forward. Right.
Did you know that there are all of these investment firms now that are actually, what they're doing is they are literally offering as a service to track the portfolios of Congress people and senators and say, hey, like this is XYZ elected officials' portfolio. We'll just replicate it for you.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And according to at least one analysis that I found, members of Congress outperformed the S&P the last 4 years in a row. Yeah. We do already have to report any trades that we make, although it's on a 45-day lag. So I'm not giving you investment advice, but like just know if you invest in one of those funds that tracks members of Congress, it's actually like you're investing off of what they did 45 days ago. Just
got it.
And especially in volatile markets. I mean, yeah.
But I'm hopeful we can get this done. And it's fun to, in this climate, have like at least one good bipartisan thing to work on. So it's been a fun project.
Seth, you've been amazing. Anything else that you think our listeners should know about or that you want to share with your constituents?
Oh man, I'm always looking for good ideas. Like I am so happy for the two of you and like how successful you've been at this. And
the feeling is mutual to you, Seth, my goodness. And to all our listeners, by the way, like I had no idea that there was such a tremendous opportunity in like a state treasurer's office or whatever. Like all these things sound so cool. And to basically be in an asset management role and get so much hands-on experience from a young age, like that's really cool.
Yeah. It's a tough job interview though, just so you know.
I'm sure.
Getting elected.
Do you ask brain teasers?
Do I ask brain teasers?
Of your junior people coming in.
Oh, you're talking about like it's like to work for a state treasurer at the staff level.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Especially if you're like between college and an MBA or between like something like that. Like it's a good like entry level job. For sure.
One of the things that I admire so much about you, Seth, is just in talking to you and in knowing you so long. One of the things that as millennials, right, we've seen a wholesale repricing of the view of elected political officials in our mind from being like, God, remember when you were like 8 years old and it was like, I want to be president. And now you hear, I think just in kind of everyday parlance, and everyone just has this like frustration and disgust generally with politics. And talking to you and seeing your legitimate passion for these very just like cut and dry, nuts and bolts, financial issues and thinking about them in not bombastic, not these really polarizing terms is just so refreshing and inspiring, Seth. And I'm so glad that you're doing so well.
I appreciate you saying that. And I'm getting the death glare too, but I will just say this, like on that point, I've got 435 colleagues in the House, and there's maybe a dozen that are household names. And like, there are definitely some people who are just here trying to be famous and some people who just absolutely suck in whatever way. But there were also a lot of people who really do take their job seriously and are like good to work with. And so even though these are challenging times politically, it's not all bad.
Oh, we love it. Well, thank you so much, Seth. We so appreciate you taking the time. We will
All right.
share this
Thank you
recording
both.
with you. And congrats again on everything.
Thanks. You too.
Thank
Okay.
you so much, Seth.
Bye.